If you cross a snare drum and a tom to get a snom, what happens when you cross a snare with a rototom? Do you get a roto snom? Hey, my name is Joel, and snoms have become a thing in the last few years in the drumming world. If you don't know what a snom is, they're sometimes called a baritone snare drum. They're essentially snare drums that have been crossed with toms, more or less. So they're often like floor toms that have been turned into snare drums by adding snare beds to the bottom edge and putting a strainer and the wires on. Or maybe they're a converted marching snare that they've put legs on so that it can actually sit at an appropriate height for a seated drummer. In any event, they tend to be around 13, 14, 15 inches diameter, tom dimensions fairly deep, and they have snare functionality, but because they're so big and so deep and often tuned so low, they sometimes aren't optimal as snare drums, and also because the bottom head is often very tight because it's a snare drum and you want to get good response from the snare wires. Sometimes that kind of messes up the way the thing resonates, so it makes for a weird tom as well. So it's sort of kind of an in-between, and that has been my experience with snoms for the most part. I actually had a converted Ludwig marching snare that had legs on it that I used as a snom for a while and never quite warmed up to how to use it, because since it's not really optimal as a snare drum nor as a tom, it's kind of its own thing, and so you have to approach it totally differently. But this video was not intended to be about snoms or even a roto snom. Instead, I was wanting it to be about a really unique snare drum that I found on the internet a couple of weeks ago. I ran across a listing for a pearl Vari-Pitch snare drum, and if you don't know what that is, it's basically a snare drum that has a rototom for the batter head instead of a regular head on the shell kind of arrangement. And I further noticed that the seller was a friend of mine who lived about 20 minutes down the road, so I reached out to him and said, hey, I have never seen one of those in person. Now, I do remember seeing them in the Pearl catalog when I was a kid. They had toms and snare drums, but I'd never seen one in person, and so when I found out that he had one, I was kind of excited. I reached out and said, hey, can I borrow that, kind of mess with it, maybe make a video about it? He said, sure, come pick it up. So I was supposed to have it for a couple of days, and that was 2 weeks ago, so I'm sorry, I'll get it back to you like probably tomorrow, because I'm about done with it. Because I have been messing with this thing, and let me tell you, it was not at all what I expected. I was thinking this would be about a cool, interesting snare drum that was made, 45 years ago that most people probably aren't familiar with. And instead, I realized it's a really unique drum of its own, truly interesting and creative. So I'm going to talk about why that is. But first, if you're not familiar with the Pearl Vari-Pitch drums, they were a line of drums that Pearl came out with in the mid-70s, and they made them through about 1980 or 81 maybe. I know that by the 82 catalog, they were no longer listed as a current product. But they basically took Remo Rototoms and mounted them to a phenolic drum shell. And phenolic, if you don't know what that is, similar to what was once called Bakelights, basically a wood pulp and resin, or phenolic shells are often made from paper impregnated with resin to make it, stiff, hard. And it was a material that Pearl had available during the 70s, and they made their drums in 4 different shells. They made maple shells, they made wood fiberglass shells, which was Luan that had fiberglass on the inside. They made fiberglass shells, and they made phenolic shells. And for the Vari-Pitch drums, for whatever reason, they all used phenolic shells. I don't know what the reasoning is. In fact, if you do know the reason, please comment below, because I would love to know why they did that. But phenolic shells with rototoms sitting on top. And first and foremost, they were concert toms. Didn't have bottom heads on them. And so they looked pretty cool because all of the mounting apparatus was sort of inside the drum, so they didn't really have lugs. They were kind of cool looking. And later, before they ended production of the Vari-Pitch line, they did actually have some double-headed toms and floor toms as well that had bottom heads sort of like this does. But they made 3 different snare drums. This is the smallest, most shallow of them all. This is the 5-inch shell. They also made one with a 6.5-inch shell, and they made one with a 10-inch shell with this whole thing on top of it. So I was expecting to have a really cool snare drum to play with, and the truth was it was a really weird, kind of poor performer in the traditional snare drum role. It had a lot of sustain that I could not minimize. Single ply heads didn't sound good on it. It's got a double ply head, an Aquarian response too. But I was feeling kind of bad that I was going to wind up making a video, if I made one at all, that really couldn't really sing the praises of the drum as I was hoping to. So it's sort of like, you know, kind of awkward. Thanks for letting me borrow this drum and making a video about it, and I know that you're selling it, but yeah, it's not very good. I didn't like it at all. And so I was sort of bummed about that, but the more that I thought about why it behaves the way it does, of course, you know me if you've watched my videos, I'm always intrigued about the why. Why do drums sound and behave and, you know, act the way they do? What are the physics behind it? And as I thought about it, the fact that it's a Rototom on top, I started to realize, oh, well, that's why. And then started to think, you know, it might actually be really good in a Snom type application. In fact, it might be really cool in a Snom application. So then I stuck it to the left of the hi-hat and started doing different tunings and playing with it differently, and came up with some things that I really like, though I must admit I'm probably sort of at the front end of learning how to utilize an instrument like this, but it's really, really intriguing and I would like to continue. So let's talk about some of those characteristics that this thing has. First and foremost, it has a Rototom on top. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Rototoms, but this is a Rototom. Let me show you what I mean. So when I say that this thing has a Rototom on top, I literally do mean a Rototom. This is a 14-inch Remo Rototom. This is mine. I actually have the full set, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, and 18. Probably should do a video on them sometime because I haven't really talked about them yet, and they are unique and they're really cool, so maybe I'll do that. But getting back to this, let me show you something here. So with the exception of the fact that this one says Remo Rototom in it, and this one says Pearl Vari-Pitch, they're both Remo Rototoms. They are identical. Identical. Rototoms don't have shells. They have frames. They have cast metal frames that are very, very heavy. They're very hard, very dense. And the frame that fits underneath the head, acting as the bearing edge, has a fairly reasonably sharp bearing edge. So all of that said, it's not really built to absorb much energy from the drum head the way a lot of drum shells that are very thin, lightweight, and sometimes have rounder edges can pull the energy from the drum head so the head doesn't resonate as much on a regular drum. But on a Rototom, heads tend to resonate a long time. Which is a little weird when you think about it for a snare drum, because snare drums typically are very punctual sounds. Even big fat snare drums that are tuned really loosely have really short punctual sounds. So having a long sustaining sound that has snare wires going along with is kind of weird. That's kind of a weird thing. Another thing that makes it weird for snare use is the fact that it has all this open space. This is what I would call an open design, as opposed to a closed or a sealed design. In a typical drum, you've got drum heads, top and bottom of the drum shell, that basically seal off the shell, so you have an enclosed, sealed environment. And yes, there is a vent in the side, a little grommet or whatever to kind of equalize the pressure, but it can't move a volume of air fast enough to keep there from being back pressure inside the drum. So when you hit a double-headed drum, the air pressure inside is activating the bottom head, as well as the sound pressure of the top head making noise. In an open design like this, where there's basically no real air pressure at all, then the air pressure is not really activating the bottom head and therefore the snare wires. So it's really sound pressure that's activating the snare wires, and that makes it kind of weird. The lack of closed environment also means that when you're playing on the drum, there's no air column that's moving, creating some back pressure, some pushback on the drum, so it feels different to play. Sort of like playing concert toms instead of double-headed toms. If you've ever done that, the concert toms, they just sort of die. So if you ever do like press rolls or buzz rolls, things like that on a drum like this, an open design, it doesn't give you the feedback, and buzz rolls don't buzz as much and things like that. So it just feels different to play. Also, because of the open design, we can not only see inside the drum shell, we can hear inside the drum shell. And hearing the inside of a snare drum is not, to me, a terribly, terribly pleasant experience. It's sort of akin to listening to the bottom head. Now, on a closed design, the sound is kind of happening vertically. The heads are doing this, and the sound is more or less shooting out the bottom of the drum when you play. And so you're hearing the snare response bouncing off the floor and around the room and things like that. With an open design like this, the sound is just radiating horizontally 360 degrees. So that means all the microphones on the kit potentially are picking up more leakage of that sort of snare rattle type sound from an open design drum. And that's true for any snare drum that's kind of an open design. In recent years, I've seen many drums that have huge holes drilled into the side of the shell between the lugs. And Ludwig actually used to make slotted drums, marching snares, and they made a slotted Coliseum snare drum, which was basically two really shallow shells that were held in place by stretch lugs, so that you basically were missing the middle of the shell. And lastly, the open design means that the top head's not going to get choked at all, because in a traditional snare drum, which is a closed design, basically, only that little vent allowing for any kind of equalization of the air pressure, the bottom head is typically very, very tight on a snare drum, certainly compared to how you would normally do it on a rack tom, for example. And so that head being really tight and that bottom edge having snare beds cut into it to allow for the contour of the snare wires to really fit the bottom head, all of that goes to stifling the resonance or the sustain of the bottom head. And because it's a more or less sealed environment, it sort of stifles the top head too. So even when you tune the batter head fairly low to get a deeper pitch out of the drum, it doesn't just resonate. Whereas this drum, it does. So like I say, it's a really interesting combination of physics, basically making a drum that is really a creative device, truly. And because of the sustain that's inherent to the Rototoms and the fact that there's no air pressure that's really stopping that sustain, it does perform well as a tom when you want it to be a tom. If Snoms are supposed to be sort of like toms sometimes, and then you flip on the snares, you want them to be snares, this really does have more sustain than most Snoms, because again, in order to make the Snom sound sort of like a snare and respond like a snare somewhat, you're probably going to have to crank that snare side head up enough to really get good contact and behavior with the wires to get some decent snare response. And when you flip the snares off, that tension in that sealed environment is going to kind of stifle the top head. So if you want more sustain, this is a cool way to do it. And it's super useful, particularly in a live situation, because you can just twist it. I mean, a microphone on it down flappy like that would be like sounding like a bass drum, really. You can certainly process it with some EQ and make it sound that way. And then on the next song, crank it up and make a timbali, right? And you can make a snare drum out of it, or you can tune the thing down. You could drop some weight on it, like a wallet or something, and have kind of a dead snare sound, albeit rather bright, because again, the sound is coming out the side and the snares are being activated only by sound pressure, not by air pressure as well. So it is a unique, interesting little beast, but it was a lot of fun to play with. I've had it way too long. Dave, I'm sorry. I will return it to you very shortly. Thank you for letting me use it. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I've got some audio of this thing coming up next, so stay and watch that, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.